So today, I'd like to talk about this transition away from hydrocarbons. So we're used to talking about the energy transition. We're also used to talking about net zero emissions. But increasingly, I'm more interested in shifting the focus to production of fossil fuels first, but then you could also look more broadly at extraction of oil and gas, not just for fossil fuels, but for petrochemicals. So that's what we'll talk about today. But I'll begin by starting with this idea or proposition around regenerative architecture as carbon stewardship as kind of an entrance point, and then talk about why we need not just an energy transition, but a materials transition, and what's the place of architecture in this, which is something that, since you're researching non-extractive architecture, you're probably better poised to answer than I am. But hopefully we can have a good discussion. And kind of one way in is with this climate math or carbon math, which is this question of where do you put 1 trillion tons of CO2 that are in the atmosphere? And right now the emissions are towards 50 gigatons or billion tons of CO2 equivalent per year. So a good part of that is CO2, but you'll notice that there's also a lot of other greenhouse gases. And this is kind of the 2 degrees template, right? Emissions have to cut, we have to cut them very soon, starting right now, dramatically. And at the same time, we have to start building this infrastructure for removing CO2. That's this green portion at the bottom of this figure, the negative CO2 emissions, so that near the end of the century, we could reach this net zero point. But if we're striving for this 1.5 degree target, as nations agreed to do under the Paris Agreement, that net zero point needs to be closer to 2050, which is why there have been all these net zero by 2050 emissions targets you've probably read about. So that's kind of one way of looking at the task at hand. And carbon removal is something that's playing a few different roles in these net zero scenarios. So it can compensate for some amount of continued CO2 emissions or residual emissions from sectors that are hard to mitigate, which are generally regarded to be things like aviation and shipping, nitrous emissions from fertilizer production, some emissions left from industry and buildings. So if you have some amount of positive emissions, it's compensated by some amount of carbon removals, there's net zero. But it's also compensating for these emissions of the other greenhouse gases like the nitrous oxide or methane potentially. And carbon removal is also compensating for historical emissions in some scenarios or cases. So if there is an overshoot of these temperature targets, it could be used later in the century or in the next century to bring greenhouse gas concentrations down. So those are the few different ways people are talking about carbon removal, also sometimes referred to as negative emissions. And this has really been of increasing attention, particularly since 2018, which is when the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released this special report on 1.5 degrees. And I mean, what it says exactly is that all pathways that limit global warming to 1.5 with limited or no overshoot project the use of carbon dioxide removal on the order of 100 to 1,000 gigatons over the century. So to compensate for these residual emissions, and in most cases, achieve net negative emissions to return global warming to 1.5 following a peak. So once that became recognized as a scientific consensus of sorts, it's a bit more complicated than that, but this was kind of a tipping point in how companies were thinking about it, how NGOs were thinking about what needed to happen. And so these are some of the techniques for removing carbon dioxide presented in this kind of menu format. Some are more mature than others. Often these are categorized into biological carbon removal, so using land and ocean sinks for the carbon, and industrial or technological carbon removal. And I won't talk about all of these methods in detail, but I will mention a couple. Soil carbon sequestration is something people are excited about because the soil is such a reservoir for carbon, and so much soil carbon has been lost over this period of industrial agriculture that there's a real opportunity to store more carbon in soils. You can do that by selecting for, perhaps even engineering plants that have longer root systems, also through farming in ways that conserve more carbon, no-till farming, cover crops, etc. So that's one area. Afforestation is obviously of great interest as well. The thing with some of these land-based carbon removals is that after you remove the carbon by planting this forest or changing how you farm, you have to keep on holding that carbon there. Because those sinks plateau over time. And if there's a wildfire, then you lose your carbon again, which is, I think, a good part of why people are also looking at industrial carbon removal systems that could remove carbon year on year on year, indefinitely through the lifespan of that infrastructure, or until underground reservoirs for carbon are full. But that's not expected to be a limitation at all. So I'll talk briefly about two techniques for that. One is bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, which is something that's included in a lot of the models for how we curb warming to these temperature targets. So basically harvesting biomass, combusting it, making electricity, and separating out the CO2 and injecting it underground for storage. And there's a few of these facilities already, but not many. I think a lot of the ones that are being designed are intended to use agricultural waste or forestry waste, so not dedicated cropland for bioenergy, because people recognize kind of the land limitations and the trade-offs in terms of using your land to grow food versus for this kind of a process. So the other technique that's gaining attention is something called direct air capture. So extracting CO2 from the air using machines like the figure at the top is Climeworks' facility in Iceland. The bottom is just a visualization of what something like this might look like. It has a smaller direct land footprint, but it also would need to have ample renewable energy to power this kind of a process. And we could get into the details of that, but the point I would make with all of this is that the current vision for achieving these large-scale carbon removals tends to happen in diagrams or renderings, graphs. So we haven't really fully explored how people live, work, and play in these kind of worlds with this infrastructure and these systems, what the social relationships are like in those worlds. And so I think there's a role for art, for design, for storytelling that goes beyond visualizing, carbon removal products or practices that are embedded in this current capitalist landscape, to something more holistic and more radical. And I wanted to engage a bit with this idea about regenerative architecture. So I'm not an architect at all. I'm not super familiar with the field, to be honest, although I was drawn into it, I guess maybe first with this issue of Log magazine that I recommend checking out, that was guest edited by Lisa Turbe, and she looks at, the whole issue is about overcoming carbon form. So I wrote a short piece for that and started engaging with some of the other ideas in that volume. And I know that there's a discussion about regenerative architecture that kind of stems from the regeneration discourse more broadly, which I guess has one strand in kind of sustainable business and another strand in regenerative agriculture, the soil carbon farming I was speaking about. And, there's this idea about these living buildings, right, that generate energy, water independent. So regenerative in that sense, regeneration is a frame, is something that I've heard people say goes beyond sustainability, because sustainability is kind of like maintaining the status quo, but regenerative is really trying to repair past damage. So you could think about that in terms of carbon, in terms of, what does designing the outdoor landscapes that remove carbon in terms of trees or plants or blue carbon, et cetera. There's also a lot of interest in designing buildings that are built with carbon neutral or carbon negative materials. Pretty interesting stuff going on with cement and engineered wood right now. But I guess I'm more interested in these latter suggestions, which haven't maybe been explored as much within the existing regenerative architecture paradigm, which is designing industrial carbon removal sites to be something aesthetically interesting and welcomed and a point of pride in the community and someplace pleasant to work, right? But then also thinking about materials that substitute for the petrochemicals that we're using now. And this is another big question, right? How do we end oil and gas extraction? Which I see actually bound up with these questions of carbon removal and what sort of energy system we have and what sort of net zero we have, if it's a net zero world with a lot of residual emissions, or a net zero world that's really in a genuine transition to not having any emissions anymore, which I think is feasible near the end of the century. Obviously not overnight, but we are designing technologies that can substitute for a lot of things. So this is a really interesting report on the production gap, which is the difference between what countries are planning to produce in terms of fossil fuels and what would be coherent with a low carbon 1.5 degrees scenario. Basically, this report found that the world would need to be decreasing fossil fuel production by 6% per year between 2020 and 2030. But instead, countries are planning an average annual increase of 2%. So there's this gap between what we know we need to do and the production that's already being planned. And part of the challenge is that the net zero climate discourse focuses on emissions, not on production. So does the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement doesn't mention fossil fuels at all. So does the Green New Deal. In the US, we have this Green New Deal resolution, which was kind of like a blueprint for a lot of the conversations from 2019. And it frames things also in terms of climate math. Global temperatures must be kept below 1.5 degrees Celsius. That requires net zero global emissions by 2050. It's not focused on production either. So even with a progressive kind of template, we don't have this focus on the production. This may be changing. So if you follow climate and energy policy, you might have seen this report that came out probably 2 weeks ago now by the International Energy Agency that got a lot of attention because it says that, we need to stop production. So in their roadmap for net zero by 2050, it begins with, right now, no new unabated coal plants approved, no new oil and gas fields approved for development, no new coal mines. So it's right there. It's become reasonable to say that, which is really a change, I think, from a few years ago. But then what does a company who derives profit from fossil fuels do if demand for fossil fuels is projected to decline? it turns to petrochemicals quite possibly. A lot of companies are thinking about this. The IEA projected a few years ago that petrochemicals are becoming the largest driver of oil consumption, and they're set to account for more than a third of the growth in oil demand to 2030, nearly half to 2050, while these dominant sources of oil demand for transportation, for example, are declining. So petrochemicals are, I don't know people's familiarity. I'm not a chemist, so I'm not going to say my familiarity is super great, but basically there's 6 main components of plastics, right? Ethylene, propylene, butylenes, benzene, etc. Making up plastics, nylons, polyesters, really a lot of the stuff. I'm sure if you look around the room that you're in, you'll see a lot of things that were manufactured with petrochemicals. And so with this kind of pivot of industry, the oil and gas industry, we may be kind of awash in petrochemicals. I think that's one risk. One thing is that oil and gas companies are kind of changing the facilities in which they manufacture these. So building these larger complexes. It used to be kind of just one part of a refinery, and now really building kind of larger, more flexible facilities for petrochemical manufacture. And so, I think one thing this tells us is that we need different sorts of exit strategies or off-ramps for oil and gas companies. And I don't think we should make an argument for transitioning away from petrochemicals as well, which I haven't heard too many people talk about yet. So there may be, we should have a discussion about it. There may be things that I'm blind to that would crash this argument, but it does seem that there's a lot of, air, water, land pollution, end-of-life disposal issues. We don't really have functional recycling systems in most places. There's impacts upon the communities where oil and gas extraction is taking place. There's climate impacts from this stuff. So obviously there's a lot of benefits from petrochemicals too, but are these harms worth it? I would say that if there are alternatives to just extracting oil and gas and making this stuff, then probably not, and we should be going for those alternatives. And so one thing that's come up a lot lately is this idea of recycling carbon. So putting carbon into this circular carbon economy framework. This is one diagram from the Circular Carbon Network. And obviously there's kind of shorter term carbon cycles and very long term carbon cycles. But it's interesting how they will put kind of everything on the same page, right, as part of one umbrella of carbon recycling. So different ways of capturing, utilizing carbon directly from the air or from other, sometimes you'll see carbon capture and utilization technologies alongside the manipulating these more organic or longer term carbon cycles. And it's interesting that a lot of oil and gas companies have leaned into this framework. This is from the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative. So they see that as kind of one part of producing cleaner oil and gas. Some work from research organizations in Saudi Arabia, also very interested in this framework, because obviously there's a version of it which does legitimize continued production, and it's okay to keep producing this stuff as long as you're recycling it responsibly at the end. I guess that's the logic of it. On the other hand, though, if you have the technology to recycle the carbon, then actually I don't see why you need to keep extracting it. I mean, if that's technology matures, you could hopefully phase out the extraction at the beginning and just be reusing and recycling. And And there are actually new technologies that can utilize and recycle carbon. It's not purely greenwashing. The tech increasingly exists at various scales for making all sorts of products, including fuels. Fuels can be made from captured carbon, and this is one option for aviation, for example. Alongside something like biofuels, it's possible that this solar to fuels or running these carbon recycling processes using renewable energy could be better than biofuels. I don't know how that will shake out in general, but it's something people are discussing. So it doesn't necessarily have to be greenwashing, although there's obviously a version of this that would be. The second alternative is biomaterials. So this is obviously comes up a lot in terms of substituting plastic in packaging, food packaging, all sorts of plastic packaging. Obviously, there's good things about this, both in terms of sourcing the feedstock and end-of-life disposal. And I've really seen this, I think my assessment is that it's more popular in the EU than in the US with this circular bio-based economy discourse. But maybe you know more about that than I would actually. And then there's a fair question, well, you know, what does this do with architecture and actual buildings if maybe some of it is short-lived? But I do think there's technological advancements that people are really looking at using some of these materials in insulation or interior design. Then, you know, I obviously do have the question, is this kind of like a niche art world thing and not something that will be part of industrial life? But I do think that, you know, my read of it is that actually there are some really interesting possibilities here. And the next step would really be to conduct, for me, if I was going to pursue this as a research agenda, is to conduct interviews with scientists working in this space, having them systematically gauge what are the barriers to larger scale up of these. So, I mean, to wrap up, what does all of that have to do with architecture? I think that obviously people building things are cautious about using new or unfamiliar materials. This has come up a lot in discussions about lower carbon concrete produced via other processes. And, you know, people are working to get things like that into procurement as one way of scaling it up. So because governments are such purchasers of concrete, that could really kind of kickstart some of these markets, but jurisdictions are cautious about, you know, they know the material profile of what they've been using. This other stuff is newer, right? And I think that would probably be a caution for other sorts of materials too. But I think that, you know, we can begin this work just by making an attractive vision of a world without newly extracted hydrocarbons. I haven't seen so many things that comprehensively imagine what the world without hydrocarbon materials would look like. So I think that's an exciting space to explore. And I look forward to talking with you what you see as the possibilities and limitations with it. Because I do think that if we're talking about energy transition, that kind of this materials and hydrocarbon transition is a necessary part of it. Otherwise, you know, maybe we get rid of fossil fuels, but we have a bunch more plastic, and that's not necessarily the future we want. So I'll wrap up there and look forward to questions and discussion.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Holly. That was great. Really interesting things that you presented. I think there's a lot of points that we can jump off from here, because here at V-A-C Zattere, we're really looking to collect materials, ideas, architectures, case studies that are working towards exactly what you described. But I think especially the point you brought up about, which is in a way a form of extraction or extractive architecture, right? These technologies of negative emission technologies at the scale of a landscape or the scale of these really large buildings, and the sort of excitement that you talked about, what these could mean for communities and the design of these spaces, I think is something that's really interesting. I just want to say to the people watching that if you have questions, you can write them in the Q&A button, and we can get to them. And they can be part of the conversation. So feel free to add your questions to the Q&A tab. Maybe I open it up to our residents if you guys have questions for Holly. Anyone just want to start? Yeah.
Hi, Holly. Thank you so much. This is more of a just comment or something that you made me think of rather than a question, but I think as architects working with these really large problems, it becomes very easy to kind of almost make the excuse that policy is such a bigger determiner of these situations that sometimes architecture can feel quite futile or very small in comparison to this. But I think this last point that you ended on is quite interesting. It kind of speaks to this sort of dance between maybe imagining futures and then policy adopting that, where architecture can kind of step into that role a bit. And this is one of the things I appreciated a lot from your book, where you also use fictions and you use world building as a way of, I don't know, sort of taking climate science out of these like numerical doom and gloom projections. Maybe you could speak a bit about your own use of fiction or world building in your practice, or in your writing, for example.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't gotten too explicit with articulating my theory of change, but I think the theory of change I'm working from is that, you know, policy is critical. The market is not going to drive these very large scale transformations we need, but in order to get the policy in place, we need demand from people. And I'm not actually sure if it needs to be widespread public popular demand or even just demand from kind of elite actors that have a lot of discursive power. So I mean, I would like to test that. But there does have to be demand from constituents of some sort that are organized in some way, right? And so where does that demand come from? Is there a way to stimulate that demand? I mean, I think the demand is, it's a desire, right? And it's a desire that it's hard to have that desire before you can imagine what these worlds look like. Or how can you have that desire if you haven't heard of the idea of removing carbon? So the first thing is this kind of communications, storytelling, dialogue, creating desirable visions. It's the first order before you can get to the policy. At least that's my view of it.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for the lecture. And you talk a lot about the building that remove carbon. And we are talking and trying to describe and define what is non-extractive architecture. Can you give and provide your answer on this question? From your perspective, what is non-extractive in the case of architecture?
Yeah, it's interesting because there's this, even with carbon removal, there's this discourse of extracting the carbon or mining the air. So in some ways, there's a way of kind of continuing this extractivist mentality and just transferring it onto carbon. But I guess non-extractive would be, you could define it in terms of circularity, which also might be not expansive enough. I think that there needs to be a component too about the social relations. I mean, I guess if I don't love binaries, but maybe the opposite of extraction is giving, you know, architecture that gives to the people who are in it, who are having an experience, or, you know, enhances their life in some way. And I think that the institute behind that Living Buildings Challenge was trying to go for that when they made this like different petals, and one of them is equity. Like people are thinking about how to put the social relations, but it's also tricky because you don't want to be in this determinist way where the architecture determines the social relations. So I grew up in a planned town that was planned in the 1960s, where the architects were really thinking about how to make it more socially level and kind of embed these values of community. So there were no churches built in this town. There are only interfaith centers where every group could come and have their meetings. And, you know, they trying to do different sorts of mixed housing experiments and so forth. So, and I don't know how well it worked. I don't know if you can really encode these social values or social relations into the landscape, but yeah, interesting to think about anyway. I think that that would be part of non-extractive for me, is thinking about fostering social relations, but figuring out how to do that without prescribing them, I guess.
Thank you.
Yeah. I think we have a question in the chat as well that I'm not sure if you can see it, but I can read it out to you maybe. So this is from Luke Jones, who's another one of the residents. He's just not in the room right now. And he says, as a follow-on, how different do you think that a post-carbon world needs to be socially, culturally, economically from that which has arisen in the era of oil, coal, etc.? Do you think that non-extractivism leads to particular social forms?
Well, I think that you could have a post-carbon world that is still really extractive. Well, I mean, we can see this in all the discourse about the mining for renewables, right? And all the critical materials for the batteries and the conditions, and you know, so there's that. So yeah, I do think that non-extractive is a better goal in a lot of ways than post-carbon for that reason. And my intuition is that non-extractivism does lead to particular social forms. I think that maybe one dimension of that has to do with responsibility, and kind of taking responsibility for these products throughout their whole life cycle. I would guess leads to a different sort of thinking about your place in the world and your place in the community and all that kind of thing. Probably in ways that we might interpret right now as a burden, but maybe, you know, a social form or a cultural form would grow that views it differently. But it's just an intuition. I don't really have like a study to support that intuition.
One of the questions I was interested in the research is how architecture can function through this waste management paradigm. Can you speak a bit more? I think you mentioned this in your book a bit, how like the need to adopt a waste management paradigm for carbon, or thinking of carbon as a waste product. This is a very broad question, but can you maybe speak to that concept of waste a little bit more? Carbon as waste.
I mean, one thing I got interested in is, you know, how societies started to manage different forms of waste in terms of evolving both municipal waste systems for solid waste, but also systems for dealing with treatment of wastewater. And, you know, it was often went back and forth between people advocating for this as public infrastructure, you know, but also people arguing for private collection that would be more efficient or better, but then, you know, fighting back against these kind of private collection empires and building public systems. So I think that, I mean, there's a couple takeaways looking back at the history of how that has evolved and obviously is continuing to evolve, especially considering the lack of functional plastics recycling, for example. I think that the early successes were really driven by coordinated social movements that actually a lot of them formed around the problem of smog and cleaning up the air. And then they got, you know, this sanitation movement more broadly took up things like sewage as well. So it was partly that, but it was also engineers had a huge role, and this was all happening while engineering was developing as a profession. So really there are these, you know, multiple ingredients of the social movement and the movement from the engineers. And could we see a similar development right now when it comes to cleaning up carbon waste, which is challenging because it's not visible in the same way. I think that finding ways to visualize it would help in terms of, you know, the social movement. Obviously, we have a social movement around climate change, but it's not really focused on cleaning up carbon waste necessarily in the same way. And we also do have engineers and scientists leading the way in kind of their own ways. But I don't know, but I do think that success in one area may transfer to another. So there could be a positive feedback loop. So if we could make progress on recycling some of those coalitions, or, you know, we would have some energy to transfer it to carbon waste and so forth.
I have a question in regards to, I guess, the kind of case studies and policies that you talk about are very much more Western based. If you have any, I guess, case studies or examples of more global South or non-Western based kind of case studies or policies, or even local activist groups that are kind of pushing for a post-carbon future?
I would say that, I mean, my impression is that this discourse about negative emissions or carbon removal has been pretty much grounded in, you know, the policy debates in the global North. That said, there's obviously one current that's thinking about supporting smallholder farmers and thinking about carbon in farming, in smallholder systems and agroecology and all of that. There's also thinking about some of the stuff I've talked about with the materials transition, you know, the fight against plastic bags and banning plastic bags is actually something that began in the global South, in Bangladesh in particular, but also other countries, and really emerged as a bottom-up campaign. And so that's kind of in contrast to some narratives of, you know, having environmentalisms or environmental norms that are imagined to spread from NGOs in the global North to global South areas. This was really, in some ways, the opposite way around. But in terms of kind of industrial carbon removal, I think that this is still pretty much dominated by a few companies. And even when there are projects, like I was reading today a case study of a carbon capture and storage project in Indonesia, but the research was still funded by actors in Norway and Australia. And so I wonder about, the balance of power in terms of who is getting to define the research questions and all that kind of thing. So rambling answer, I don't think I have any particular case studies I would point to. But if you all do, I'd love to hear about them.
Second question.
We have one more question from the chat, which was, in terms of climate fictions and design speculations, do you think that we're more in need of local heterodox visions or big global ones?
That's an interesting question, because part of the challenge with local visions is people just think, oh, that's for that place, that doesn't apply to me. Sometimes I think that's a risk. But big global ones can equally feel alienating. I guess one of the things I'm interested in personally is how these scales interact. I think regional is a really important scale when it comes to some of the things I've been discussing, because oftentimes something like waste management or, water management or some of these kind of bioregion, like the region is the natural scale for a grid, perhaps, for a lot of the things that we're concerned with. So I think that might be the scale I would try to work on first, but looking at how they inform each other or are in conflict is also really interesting.
Okay, thank you so much, Holly. I don't want to take up too much of your day. We really are so happy to have had you as part of this project and part of this platform. And really, thank you so much for your lecture. And we hope we can connect with you as this project develops and share with you some of the research that's happening here in Venice, and also connect with you as we work towards this volume 2 of the book, Non-Extractive Architecture on Designing Without Depletion, that will come out in January 2022. So we'll definitely be in touch and hope to speak with you more.
Thanks so much. Yeah, I can't wait to see your research and your work. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Bye, Holly.